So here we are at the last chapter of The Trumpet and the Swan by E.B. White. The Greening Spring. Louis and Serena were more in love than ever. When spring came, they flew north. Louis wearing his trumpet and his slate and his chalk pencil and his medal. Serena wearing nothing at all. Now that he no longer had to work and earn, Louis felt a great sense of relief. No more would he have to carry a money bag around his neck. The two swans flew high and fast, 10,000 feet above the earth. They arrived at last at the little pond in the wilderness where Louis had been hatched. This was his dream, to return with his love to the place in Canada where he had first seen the light of day. He escorted Serena from one end of the pond to the other and back again. He showed her the tiny island where his mother's nest had been. He showed her the log Sam Beaver had been sitting on when Louis had pulled his shoelace because he couldn't say beep. Serena was enchanted. They were in love. It was spring. The frog was waking from his long sleep. The turtle was coming to life again after his nap. The chipmunk felt the warm air, soft and kind, blow through the trees, just as it did in that springtime when Louis's father and mother had visited the pond to nest and raise their young. So here's Louis and Serena at the pond. The sun shone down strong and steady. Ice was melting. Patches of open water appeared on the pond. Louis and Serena felt the changing world, and they stirred with new life and rapture and hope. There was a smell in the air, a smell of earth waking after its long winter. The trees were putting out tiny green buds. The buds were swelling. A better, easier time was at hand. A pair of mallard ducks flew in. A sparrow with a white throat arrived and sang, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." Serena chose a muskrat lodge on which to build her nest. It was the right height above the water. The muskrats had built it of mud and sticks. Louis had hoped his wife might decide to make her nest in the same spot where his mother had built hers. But females are full of notions. They want their own way. Pretty much. And Serena knew what she was doing. Louis was so delighted when he saw her begin to construct the nest. He didn't really care where it was. He raised his horn to his mouth and played the beginning of an old song called "It's Delightful to Be Married." To be married. Then he helped by bringing a few pieces of coarse grass. Rain or shine, cold or warm, every day was a happy day for the two swans. In time, the eggs were laid and the cygnets were hatched, 4 of them. The first sound the baby swans heard was the pure, strong sound of their father's trumpet. "Oh, ever in the greening spring," he played, "by bank and bough retiring." Life was gay and busy and sweet in the little lonely pond in the North Woods. Once in a while, Sam Beaver would show up for a visit, and they would have great times together. Louis never forgot his old jobs, his old friends, or his promise to the head man in charge of birds in Philadelphia. As the years went by, he and Serena returned each spring to the pond, nested, and had their young. And each year, at the end of summer, when the molt was over and the flight feathers grew back in and the cygnets were ready to try their wings, Louis took his family for a long pleasure trip across America. He led them first to Camp Coo-Coo-Coos, where he had saved the life of Applegate Skinner and won his medal. The camp would be closed for the season, but Louis liked to revisit it and wander around, remembering the boys and how he had earned his first $100 as camp bugler. Then the swans would fly to Boston, where the Swan boatman always gave them a big welcome. Louis would polish up his horn, blow the spit out of it, and swim in the front of the boats again, playing "Row, row, row your boat." And the people of Boston would hear the familiar sound of the trumpet of the swan and would flock to the public garden. Then the boatman would treat Louis and Serena to a night at the Ritz Hotel, while the cygnets spent the night by themselves on the lake, watched over by the boatman. Serena dearly loved the Ritz. She ate dozens of watercress sandwiches and gazed at herself in the mirror and swam in the bathtub. And while Louis stood and looked out of the window at the public garden down below, Serena would walk round and around, turning lights on and off for the fun of it. Then they would both get into the bathtub and go to sleep. From Boston, Louis would lead his family to the Philadelphia Zoo and show them Bird Lake. Here he would be greeted warmly by the head man in charge of birds. If the zoo needed a young trumpeter swan to add to its collection of waterfowl, Louis would donate one of his cygnets, just as he had promised. In later years, Philadelphia was also the place where they would see Sam Beaver. Sam took a job with the zoo just as soon as he was old enough to go to work. He and Louis always had a great time when they got together. Louis would get out his slate and they would have a long talk about old times. So Sam did get to do his dream of working at the zoo. After visiting Philadelphia, Louis would fly south with his wife and children so they could see the great savannas where alligators dozed in the swamp water and turkey buzzards soared in the sky. And then they would return home to spend the winter in the Red Rock Lakes of Montana, in the lovely, serene Centennial Valley where all trumpeter swans feel safe and unafraid. The life of a swan must be very pleasant and interesting life. And of course, Louis's life was particularly pleasant because he was a musician. Louis took good care of his trumpet. He kept it clean and spent hours polishing it with the tips of his wing feathers. As long as he lived, he felt grateful to his father, the brave cob, who had risked his life in order to give him the trumpet he needed so badly. Every time Louis looked at Serena, he remembered that the sound of the trumpets was what had made her willing to become his mate. Swans often lived to be very old. Year after year, Louis and Serena returned in spring to the same small pond in Canada to raise their family. The days were peaceful. Always, just at the edge of dark, when the young cygnets were getting sleepy, Louis would raise his horn and play taps, just as he used to do at camp long ago. The notes were sad and beautiful as they floated across the still water and up into the night sky. One summer, when Sam Beaver was about 20, he and his father were sitting in their camp in Canada. It was after supper. Mr. Beaver was rocking in a chair, resting after a day of fishing. Sam was reading a book. "Pop," said Sam, "what does crepuscular mean?" "How should I know?" replied Mr. Beaver. "I never heard that word before." "It has something to do with rabbits," said Sam. "It says here that a rabbit is a crepuscular animal." "Probably means timid," said Mr. Beaver. "Or maybe it means that it can run like the dickens. Or maybe it means stupid. A rabbit will sit right in the middle of the road at night and stare into your headlights and never get out of the way, and that's how a lot of rabbits get run over. They're stupid." "Well," said Sam, "I guess the only way to find out what crepuscular means is to look it up in the dictionary." "We haven't got a dictionary here," said Mr. Beaver. "You'll have to wait till we get back to the ranch." Just then, over at the pond where the swans were, Louis raised his horn and played taps to let his children know that the day had come to an end. The wind was right and the sound carried across the swamp. Mr. Beaver stopped rocking. "That's funny," he said. I thought I heard the sound of a trumpet just then." "I don't see how you could," replied Sam. "We're alone in these woods." "I know we are," said Mr. Beaver. "Just the same, I thought I heard a trumpet or a bugle." Sam chuckled. He had never told his father about the swans in the pond nearby. He kept their secret to himself. When he went to the pond, he always went alone. That's the way he liked it. And that's the way the swans liked it. "Whatever happened to your friend Louis?" asked Mr. Beaver. "Louis was a trumpeter. You don't suppose he's somewhere around here, do you?" "He might be," said Sam. "Have you heard from him recently?" asked Mr. Beaver. "No," replied Sam. "He doesn't write anymore. He ran out of postage stamps, and he has no money to buy stamps with." "Oh," said Mr. Beaver. "Well, the whole business about the bird was very queer. I never did fully understand it." Sam looked across at his father and saw that his eyes had closed. Mr. Beaver was falling asleep. There was hardly a sound to disturb the stillness of the woods. Sam was tired and sleepy too. He got out his notebook and sat down at the table by the light of the kerosene lamp. This is what he wrote. "Tonight I heard Louis's horn. My father heard it too. The wind was right and I could hear the notes of taps just as darkness fell. There is nothing in all the world I like better than the trumpet of the swan. What does crepuscular mean?" Sam put his notebook away. He undressed and slid into bed. He lay there wondering what crepuscular meant. In less than 3 minutes, he was fast asleep. On the pond where the swans were, Louis put his trumpet away. The cygnets crept under their mother's wings. Darkness settled on woods and fields and marsh. A loon called its wild night cry. As Louis relaxed and prepared for sleep, all his thoughts were of how lucky he was to inhabit such a beautiful earth, how lucky he had been to solve his problems with music, and how pleasant it was to look forward to another night of sleep and another day tomorrow, and the fresh morning and the light that returns with the day. Here's the tent. So I had to go and look up crepuscular about the rabbits in the last chapter because I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I knew it. I thought it was maybe something to do with hibernating or partial hibernation because when I was teaching 2nd grade, we learned a lot of interesting words about that. But it means animals, well, it means relating to twilight. So when Sam Beaver's dad said that rabbits are stupid and they sit in the road, it's because they're active at twilights, but really probably they're blinded by the headlights of the car. So it just means animals, that wander around at twilight or right when the light is changing in the evening. I was going to go ahead and read you this last letter by E.B. White that's at the back. Because E.B. White also wrote Stuart Little and Charlotte's Web, which I didn't know was a guy. For some reason, I thought that was a woman that wrote Charlotte's Web. And I thought it was a man that wrote Stuart Little, but who knew? So it says, Dear Reader, I receive many letters from children and can't answer them all. There wouldn't be enough time in the day. That is why I'm sending you this printed reply to your letter. I'll try to answer some of the questions that are commonly asked. Where did I get the idea for Stuart Little and for Charlotte's Web? Well, many years ago, I went to bed one night in a railway sleeping car, and during the night, I dreamed about a tiny boy who acted rather like a mouse. That's how the story of Stuart Little got started. As for Charlotte's Web, I like animals, and my barn is a pleasant place to be at all hours. One day, when I was on my way to feed the pig, I began feeling sorry for the pig because, like most pigs, he was doomed to die. I'm sorry for pigs too, but I really do love bacon. This made me sad. So I started thinking of ways to save a pig's life. I had been watching a very big gray spider at her work and was impressed by how clever she was at weaving. Gradually, I worked the spider into the story that you know, a story of friendship and salvation on a farm. 3 years after I started writing it, it was published. He put in parentheses, I am not a fast worker, as you can see. I will just say, for me personally, I can't read Charlotte's Web without crying, so I've never read it to a class of students. I don't know how or when the idea for the Trumpet of the Swan occurred to me. I guess I must have wondered what it would be like to be a trumpeter swan and not be able to make a noise. Sometimes I'm asked how old I was when I started to write and what made me want to write. I started early, as soon as I could spell. In fact, I can't remember any time in my life when I wasn't busy writing. I don't know what caused me to do it or why I enjoyed it, but I think children often find pleasure and satisfaction in trying to set their thoughts down on paper, either in words or in pictures. I was no good at drawing, so I used words instead. As I grew older, I found that writing can be a way of earning a living. Some of my readers want me to visit their school. Some want me to send a picture or an autograph or a book. And some ask questions about my family and my animals and my pets. Much as I'd like to, I can't go visiting. I can't send books either. I would go broke if I sent a book to everyone who asked for one. And I do not send autographs. You will find a picture of me on the first page of this letter. I live most of the year in the country in New England. From our windows, we can look out at the sea and the mountains. I have a wife, a married son, and 3 grandchildren. Are my stories true, you ask? No, they are imaginary tales containing fantastic characters and events. In real life, a family doesn't have a child who looks like a mouse. In real life, a spider doesn't spin words in her web. In real life, a swan doesn't blow a trumpet. But real life is only one kind of life. There's also the life of the imagination. And although my stories are imaginary, I like to think that there is some truth in them too. Truth about the way people and animals feel and think and act. Thank you for all of your wonderful letters. I love to get them, even though I cannot answer each one personally. Yours sincerely, E.B. White. And then I'm just going to tell you what it says in the back about him. E.B. White was born in Mount Vernon, New York, and graduated from Cornell University. He was awarded the Laura Ingalls Wilder Medal in 1970 for both Charlotte's Web, a Newbery Honor Book, and Stuart Little. The Trumpet of the Swan was named an ALA Notable Children's Book. Mr. White, who wrote 17 books of prose and poetry, was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 1973. And then I guess it was talking about the illustrator too. The person who drew the pictures. And I never told you that. That was Fred Marcelino. So he drew all the pictures in that. The illustrator draws the pictures. The writer writes the words. So I hope you have enjoyed The Trumpet of the Swan. I really enjoyed reading it to you. And I had never read it before. So this was new for me as well. If you are inspired to write or to draw or do both, go ahead and make your own book. You never know where it will take you. I personally like to paint. You can see my paintings in the background. And sometimes I like to write, although I think I'm like E.B. White. It takes me a long time. But hey, maybe one day I'll finish a book and illustrate it and read it to you on this channel. Thank you for reading with me. I hope you enjoyed The Trumpet of the Swan.